Today I'm going to be sharing my 11 favorite books of 2025 so far. Why 11 and not an even 10? I don't know, because I had 11. I didn't want to take one out. All of these books were a 5-star read except for one. There's one that's a 4-star, which I guess I could have taken out, but I still wanted to talk about it. So we're talking about 11 books. These are going to go across mystery, thriller, horror, fantasy, fiction, and romance books because I am reading more of a broad range of genres this year and I'm finding favorites across different categories. But I'll start with my tried and true genres, mystery, thriller, and horror, and then save fantasy, fiction, and romance for the latter half. Starting with mystery books, the first one I'll mention is Penitence by Kristen Koval. This book I actually gave a 4-star when I first read it, but looking back at all the books that I read this year, I took a look back at all the books I gave 4 and 5 stars to create this list, and this book just stood out to me because it's really something that has stayed in my mind. It's a book that I think was incredibly well developed, and I ended up bumping it up from a 4 to a 5 because I think it deserves it. My only critique of the book at the time was I was wishing that there was even more mystery elements to it, that there were more things withheld from you, because it does read a little bit more like a literary fiction novel than a mystery novel, I guess. So I think my expectations at the time maybe were weighing my experience with it a little bit, and now looking back on it, I just think it was a really great book. This story primarily focuses on a woman named Angie Sheehan after the tragic night when her daughter kills her brother, and then Angie's first love, Julian, is brought in on the defense team for her daughter. In this story, you're following the Sheehan family, Angie and David, and they have a son and a daughter, and the story begins when one night the daughter kills her brother. The mother ends up reaching out to her first love, who she has not talked to in a long time, who is a defense attorney who she brings in to defend her daughter throughout the case. And this is a very complex novel about a lot of things, about forgiveness, guilt, reflecting on your past, and particularly quite a lot of commentary on the juvenile justice system. I ended up reading this book right around the same time that show Adolescence came out on Netflix, which was a huge show this year, and there's a lot of similarities between the portrayal of the stories in this book and that show and the themes that it's touching on. So if you liked Adolescence, I really would recommend picking up Penitence for another story that delves into these themes in a little bit of a different way. I'm always really impressed when an author can pull in a lot of seemingly disparate themes and weave them together in this complex, nuanced story that really just gets you opening up all these questions and these thoughts for yourself. It makes you feel very reflective. It creates these characters who feel like these real people to you, and you're kind of debating in your head which way you think certain situations would go or who you're siding with in certain situations, and there's just a ton of gray area throughout the entire story. One of my favorite authors who I think does this super well is Angie Kim, and this book reminded me a lot of an Angie Kim type of book. So I'd also say if you like Angie Kim books, I would give this one a try as well. While I enjoy really thoughtful, reflective, nuanced mysteries, I also have a good time with just a silly, ridiculous mystery as well. And that's what The Retirement Plan was for me. I would say this book is pretty comparable to The Thursday Murder Club, which is something that books get compared to quite a lot. But I do think this would be a good book to read if you enjoy The Thursday Murder Club. That is doing something different, but has a lot of the same ingredients as The Thursday Murder Club. In this story, you're following this group of older adults. It's 4 couples who are all friends. And the story begins when one of the men dies, and after that, his wife ends up collecting his life insurance policy, and it turns out he had this huge $1 million life insurance policy, so she's actually making the best out of losing her husband and reinventing her life and just kind of having a great time. And all the other women see that, and it gets them thinking, is that a good retirement plan? Maybe we should kill our husbands to collect their life insurance policies and then just go live our best lives all together. What they don't know is that the husbands also have their own plans going on. So it's kind of a cat and mouse style thriller that starts with these women trying to kill their husbands, and then they've got some stuff going on. And it was just such a fun, silly story to follow as you're seeing how all these different pieces of the chessboard are falling into place and seeing who's going to make it out alive by the end. I really enjoyed these characters. I liked watching their dynamics together. I liked seeing all the different pieces that the story had moving along. And while there were a lot of funny moments, I also think it did a pretty good job giving an authentic portrayal of relationships and how secrets in relationships can come to manifest in harmful ways. Unlike other mystery books like this, I don't believe this is starting a series, but I am definitely in reading more from this author in the future. Now going into some of my favorite thrillers that I've read so far this year. The first one is You Are Fatally Invited by Andy Pliego. I ended up reading this book alongside Kayla from Books and Lala and Liv from Liv's Library for the Literally Dead book club. So there is a video where we have our full full live discussion talking about this book, so I'll have that link down below if you want to check it out and hear more about the story. But this is a thriller that is set at this exclusive writing retreat set on this island where this reclusive author, J.R. Allister, is inviting several other mystery, thriller, horror authors out to come out to the island and join a little private writing retreat. What the writers don't know is that there are more nefarious plans at play here because someone is trying to target them and the bodies start dropping one by one. There's also a really fun games element that's sprinkled into the story as the writers are presented these games and challenges and riddles that they have to do the different nights as the retreat is going on, which I always find to be an enjoyable element to a story like this. It kind of gives it like a Clue style feel to it as well. It was chaotic, it was messy, it was a little bit cinematic at times. In a sea of pretty disappointing thriller books over the past couple of years, I think this was a really solid one. Next up is The Man Made of Smoke by Alex North. I've really enjoyed everything that I've read from Alex North, so I wasn't too surprised to enjoy this one as well, and I think this pretty much makes him one of my favorite authors now. In this story, we're following a man named Dan who is haunted by this encounter he had with a serial killer in his youth. Now that he's an adult, he has tried to move on with his life, but one day he gets a call and he finds out that his father has gone missing, and so he goes back to his hometown in a small island community to try to go figure out what happened to his dad. And as he's doing that, he ends up finding some connections to this serial killer that may explain what has gone on with his dad. The story is told from the perspective of both Dan and his father and explores how this serial killer has really haunted both of their lives for the past couple of decades, and how that has also impacted their own relationship and the regrets they both have about how that has affected them over the years. The story has a really haunting, eerie tone to it, and with the serial killer aspect to it, there were even these moments that had me creeped out while reading it. I think that's something that Alex North does so well, is he tells these crime stories or these mystery stories that also have these threads of horror tinged throughout them as well. It's just a perfect recipe. I feel like he nails it every time, and I think you can't go wrong with one of his stories. Now moving into horror, I only have one on the list so far because I have not been reading as much of this genre this year, but this one definitely stood out, and that is When the Wolf Comes Home by Nat Cassidy. The story begins, you're following this woman named Jess who is having a really bad day, and then she gets home from work, and then there's sort of a whole spectacle going on outside of her apartment where there's these people arguing, this man shows up, there's this child, and she doesn't know what to do. So she takes this child in for protection, but then things begin to escalate, and then suddenly there is this werewolf-like creature trying to attack them, and so she decides to take the boy and go on the run with him. From there, the story spirals into absolute chaos. It goes in unpredictable directions, and I really enjoyed how unique this story was. It was very fast-paced. You never knew where it was going to go next. I always appreciate it when a story can surprise me, and this one definitely did that. Now moving into some of my favorite fiction books from the year. First is Good Material by Dolly Alderton. This story follows the aftermath of a breakup between a woman and a man, and while you would usually expect for that to follow the story of the woman going on this self-empowerment journey, I feel like that's a really popular tale we've seen again and again, and the cover of this book even kind of suggests that that's the style of book it will be. It actually takes a different path, and it follows the man throughout the aftermath of the breakup. What I loved about this book was just how absolutely authentic and raw and honest it was. It was hilarious and nuanced and sad and complex and messy and just all the things that a breakup is. I feel like Dolly Alderton has lived like 50 lifetimes within her life so far because she really captured the human experience so authentically in this story. I also just found her writing style to be so refreshing. There's not a lot of plot in this. It is mostly just following characters in this slice of life type of story, but they just felt like real people to me. And it was also an incredibly British story, and I always find myself enjoying those as well. This was the first thing I read from Dolly Alderton, but I will definitely be reading more from her in the future. Next up is James by Percival Everett. This is a retelling of the adventures of Huckleberry Finn, but this time the story is told through Jim's perspective. It's totally fine if you're not familiar with the original story. You will still be able to follow and enjoy the story for what it is as well, but I do think you'll have a deeper level of appreciation for what the story is doing and how it flips certain narratives on its head if you at least familiarize yourself with the concept of the adventures of Huckleberry Finn, who these characters are, what some of the issues with that story are, just by doing some quick research and reading a little bit about the original story. The narrative of James is following Huckleberry Finn as he is faking his death death and running away, and Jim, who is an enslaved man who finds out that he's going to be sold and separated from his family, and so he decides to run away as well. They end up crossing paths and running away together down the Mississippi River, and it follows that journey throughout the story of the book. While this story is set in some incredibly harrowing times in the antebellum South, and you're following an enslaved man, and there's so much racism and so many terrible things that happen, this story has such a sense of adventure to it, and with certain ways that it's flipping the narrative and giving this character who's an enslaved man more agency and representing him as this full, complex person. It comes across almost with a sense of hope and empowerment in it as well. All in all, it's a story of survival, and I always love a story of survival no matter how it's packaged. I think this one was so excellent. It's an instant classic, and I definitely recommend picking it up. One of my absolute favorite authors of all time. It came out with another book this year, so of course it's instantly on my favorites list, and that is Wild Dark Shore by Charlotte McConaghy. I first became obsessed with this author when I read Migrations several years ago, and I just instantly connected to her writing style, the themes that she weaves into her books, the way she portrays her characters. I think she is just one of the most talented authors who's writing right now, and all of her stories have very similar themes. They tend to touch on climate change and environmentalism, and they tell these human stories that are reflecting themes about the destruction of the earth. So if you like any of her books, I think you should read all of them because they're all so wonderful. They just make you want to go outside and have an even deeper appreciation for nature and the planet that we live on. They also make you a little bit terrified for the direction that our planet is going in, which I think is important and a good urging factor so that we can be thinking about ways to make change and push for change to save our planet as much as we can. This story is a 5 minutes in the future type of story where things have just gotten a little bit worse from where they are today in reality. And you're following this family who's living on this island where the dad is responsible for taking care of a seed bank on the island. If you're unfamiliar with a seed bank, this is a protected space where you can preserve different seeds in the event of climate change and planetary destruction, so that as resources become less available, you have seeds to fall back on to then be able to replant and restore and replenish resources in the future. But things are not totally safe. The tide is rising on the island, the permafrost is melting at the seed bank, so there is this ticking clock element where destruction is imminent, and there is this sense of risk and danger, and this family is just trying to keep this in a good place for the next couple of weeks until the ship returns to come pick them up, where they will then package the seeds, take them on the ship, and go back to somewhere with safer living conditions. With so much already in the balance, they cannot take much more stress, but then a woman washes up to shore, and that just disrupts everything that they had planned. The story follows these characters together for the next couple of weeks as they're exploring who this woman is and why she washed up to shore, and she's getting to know these people. There's a very human mystery element threaded throughout the story in several different ways between these characters and the secrets that they're keeping. And all in all, this is a story about a lot of things. It's about second chances, coping with trauma, what you choose to do with your time at the end of the world, and if you choose to still look for hope and love in the face of destruction. It is just such a beautiful story, as all of hers are. I cannot recommend them enough. I have one fantasy book that I added to the list, and really this is more of just the series. I think is one of my favorites of the year. I have really been feeling myself gravitating more towards fantasy this year, which I think is in part just because thrillers have been disappointing me a little bit, and so I'm branching my reading out to try to find fresh stories and to not lose my love of reading, to not fall into a reading slump because I feel like I'm reading the same thing over and over again. So I've been diversifying my genre reading a little bit because of that. But I also think I'm finding myself pulled to these fantasy stories because they're often telling these stories that are very reflective of our real world and that have a very nice sense of catharsis to read when good is prevailing over evil in the end in these stories. The series I'm talking about specifically is the Kindred's Curse saga, and I have completed Spark of the Everflame, which I gave a 4-star. Glow of the Everflame I gave a 5-star, and I would mark as a favorite. I'm currently in the middle of the 3rd book, Heat of the Everflame, and by the middle I mean I'm on page like 800 out of a 1,000-page book and I think it's really great. It's just a little bit too long, but I'm finding the series to be so captivating, and it's really reinvigorating my love of reading in a way I haven't felt in a long time. And I think these stories are pulling to me right now just because of all of the absolute utter turmoil and chaos we are seeing in the real world every single day. I haven't read a ton of fantasy yet, so in no way am I an expert on the genre by any means, but it does seem very common that these types of stories tell these stories about people taking on these huge challenges in the world that seem like these insurmountable things where evil is just trying to come in and corrupt and oppress people and just ruin everybody's day. But then you get to follow the story of people coming together and uniting people and pushing back and speaking for a change. And yeah, there's usually like a hot dude in them that they're falling for at the same time, but there's like this greater story of combating political unrest and fighting for the good of humanity that I'm just finding so captivating right now, because those are just the things that I hope to see in the world, and that I can't understand how everyone doesn't want to see in the world. In nearly every facet of life today, there is just something going on that I just cannot even comprehend how we're moving in that direction of. Like AI is coming everywhere, and I'm like, guys, every sci-fi movie ever is telling us that robots take over the world and destroy us. Like, if not in a literal way from a robot becoming sentient and murdering us, then in like a way of the way it steals our humanity and our creativity and just corrupts people. And I don't know, I just can't understand why people are so willing to let AI take away our humanity, which sounds dramatic, but the more and more I think about it, I do think AI is very much an outsourcing of humanity in so many ways. I just feel like every sense of communication is continually pushing to be outsourced to a robot. Like, as soon as Apple integrates AI into text messaging, people won't even be writing text messages to each other anymore. They'll just be like having AI send auto replies and your robots will be talking to each other. Or on a very human level, all the stuff that is going on right now with ICE in our country and how they are taking people out of their homes who are just living their lives. These are just people. The way you can call a person illegal doesn't even compute in my brain. And it's people who like read stories like these. These are in our books, our movies, like art in the history of forever does not side with the oppressor. The oppressor is the evil in the end. So I cannot comprehend why others cannot yet comprehend this, and how you cannot be on the side of humanity and see people as human beings, which is what I've always loved about reading other people's experiences and how it helps you gain empathy for others by stepping into their shoes and seeing their story and understanding them. And I think we just need so much more of that right now. We need as much of that as we can get, because as exhausting and as frustrating as it can be, and how you want to separate yourself from people who don't match your point of view, and there's certainly cases where you have to do that to protect yourself and protect your peace and your mental health as well. The only way things will change is by coming together, finding those connection points, acknowledging the humanity on both sides, and remembering who the real enemy is. And I don't think the Kindred's Curse saga is like the most sophisticated portrayal of this, you know, in a fantasy story at all. This is just my intro, getting back into fantasy, I guess, is going through this romantasy lens, but it's making me want to open up to reading so much more of this, because it's just so cathartic to see the good side winning, to see people recognizing the humanity in one another despite their differences and the propaganda that's pushed to them. So I don't know, all of that tangent just drained my whole battery. I just had to change out my battery because I went on for so long. But I guess what I want to say is, if you're seeing the news and you're seeing what's happening in LA and you are not entirely appalled by what the government is doing by sending in the National Guard and these forces and ICE and taking away people's right to peacefully protest and have a voice, I would just encourage you to seek out other stories, because I think it's really easy in today's culture to be in an echo chamber on either side, because there's been so much that has been so divisive to separate people, and there's been so much of a like, unfollow me if you disagree, like if you don't think this, unfollow me, you shouldn't follow me if you know, anything. And while I understand where that's coming from as well, I do think that's going to make it all the more difficult for those people who can't see the humanity for who knows whatever reason to see the things that they need to get the exposure they need to change their mind. Anyways, getting into the specifics of this series, this is a romantasy series, and in this universe there are mortals and then there are what's called the descended, and the descended are essentially descendants of these demigods and anyone who falls in that line, and they're top of the line is the kindred. Those are like the gods. The mortals and the descended have been positioned against each other throughout history. Neither like the other. The mortals believe the descended are these powerful, magical, horrible people who hate the mortals, and the descended are kind of taught to look down on the mortals. And the story kicks off when Diem's mother goes missing after she sees her talking to a descended man. So Diem decides that she wants to get closer to the descended to understand them. She's a healer. She becomes the healer at the palace. And then she starts seeing a different side of the story. The greater arc of the whole series is about the mortals and the descended and understanding the separations of power between them and overcoming those throughout the series. And I just find it to be so very compelling for some reason. I really enjoy these characters. I enjoy the romance element of it a lot, but I also just enjoy what it's doing with the broader story of the series. There are some friendships that come in that have a sort of found family element to it as well. The first book very much positions itself a little bit as like there's two different love interests and two very different sides of a young woman's development and seeing which path that she's going to take. And yeah, I'm just enjoying it a lot. It's a very popular series and I can see why, because it is very enjoyable. And then moving on to the romance books that I have enjoyed this year. The first is The Love of My Afterlife by Kirsty Greenwood. This was a very cute and funny story about this woman who dies and she ends up in the afterlife, and then she has this encounter with this man who's so charming, and immediately they hit it off and she's like, I have met the love of my afterlife. But it turns out he is accidentally there because he's actually getting a dental procedure and he's under some anesthesia and he kind of slipped into the afterlife, but he's meant to live. So he ends up leaving and going back. And she's devastated because she just lost this opportunity at love, but her afterlife counselor gives her this opportunity to embark on this challenge where she gets to go back to Earth, and if she can find that guy and get him to kiss her in 10 days, then she'll actually get to stay on Earth. And so you follow her journey as she goes and tries to pursue that, but the story takes some different directions along the way and ends up just telling a really cute, fun romance story. If you're a fan of rom-coms, I feel like you'll really enjoy this because this is like the ultimate homage to rom-coms. There's tons of references throughout the entire story that are especially fun to pick up on if you're a lover of rom-coms, both in books and movies and just general culture. And I think this was also just a pretty unique idea for a romance, sending someone to the afterlife and then getting this challenge. So I always love when something has a little bit of a unique spin on it as well. And then finally, I have Not in Love by Ali Hazelwood. I feel like I had to put an Ali Hazelwood book on my list because I read Deep End earlier this year and I really enjoyed that. And then I read Not in Love because I really want to read Problematic Summer Romance, and I didn't realize that it's kind of like a spin-off of Not in Love. So I read Not in Love to gear up for Problematic Summer Romance, but I just feel like it's my year of really appreciating Ali Hazelwood. Last year I read Bride and had so much fun with that. It was just silly. It was goofy. It was exactly what I needed. The only thing I had read from Ali Hazelwood before that was The Love Hypothesis when that came out several years ago, and I just wasn't as into that as everyone else, so I kind of put off her stuff and I felt like maybe she's just not the author for me. But after Bride last year, I felt like everything turned around. Not in Love is a more erotic romance, kind of different from the rest of the stuff she did before that book came out. In the story, you're following Rue and Eli. Rue is a scientist and Eli is working with this private equity company that's coming in and potentially buying out her research grant, or the company's research grant where she works, which could completely disrupt everything that's going on there. The woman who owns the research place is also one of Rue's closest friends. She really looks up to her as a mentor, and so she doesn't want any harm to come to this company. So her and Eli are instantly put in opposition to one another. It's a little bit taboo for them to form a relationship because he's kind of seen as this outsider enemy, but they end up hooking up anyway. They end up getting this arrangement of just trying to have casual sex and leaving it at that, but of course it's a romance, and so they end up developing more in-depth feelings for each other along the arc of the story. And I think it was just really good. It was spicy, it was fun, it had authentic characters. I don't know what I was missing before, but suddenly Ali Hazelwood and me, we click. Something has clicked in my brain where I now really like her stories. So I did feel like I had to put one on the board. And I do plan on reading Problematic Summer Romance relatively soon. So we'll see how that fares and if it also ends up in my top books by the end of the year. So that's it for all of my top books of the year so far. Let me know down below if you've read any of them and what you think about them. And let me know if I convinced you to pick any of them up. But that was it for me. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on my next video. Bye.